Good evening. I'm Rose Dyson, your chair for this event on behalf of Friends of Egerton Ryerson. And this is the first time I'm ever doing a hybrid event, so please bear with me. We are pleased to see a number of you here, and I also want to welcome those of you who are joining us via Zoom. I trust it works. Is there some indication, Austin, that we can have this is actually working for them? People that are joining us virtually?
Yep.
It's okay. All right, good. So there's a letter that's being circulated that was drafted by our co-founder, Lynn Macdonald, who's not here with us this evening, but is joining us virtually, we think, from Vancouver. She drafted a letter that it was addressed to Jill Dunlop, the Minister of Colleges and Universities, and most of you have probably already seen it. We're asking for signatures on it, and it also, I think, demonstrates the position we have on the whole business of the vilification of Egerton Ryerson as the architect of residential schools. Before we start, I do wish to acknowledge that we're meeting on the traditional lands of many First Nations people, including Mississauga of the Credit, Anishwabi, I believe, Chippewa, and Wendat. So with that, I would like to introduce you to our first speaker, Patrice Dutil. I first heard him speak at an event organized by one of our fellow organizations, the Institute for Canadian Historical Education, and so I think we're in for another very interesting and stimulating experience. Now, Patrice is a veteran of the war to protect the integrity of Canadian history. And from his earliest days as a founder and editor for 5 years of the Literary Review of Canada, to his work in reviving the Champlain Society, to his defense of Sir John A. Macdonald, Henry Dundas, and Egerton Ryerson, his articles in newspapers and magazines and his podcasts have been important markers. Dutil is a professor in the Department of Politics and Public Administration at Toronto Metropolitan University. He is also a senior fellow at the Bill Graham for Contemporary International History here at the University of Toronto, and a senior fellow at the Macdonald Laurier Institute. He is the author and editor of 10 books. His new work will be coming out in June. It is entitled Statesmen, Strategists, and Diplomats, Canada's Prime Ministers and the Making of Foreign Policy. Patrice will be followed by David Wilson, whom I think is here with us, and I'll introduce him a bit later. So, Patrice, it's all yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. First, I want to thank you for coming this evening. I'm flattered that you're here, flattered that you want to hear about this topic. There are a few of us, but we are valiant, and we must continue this exchange of ideas. I want to thank Lynn Macdonald for her leadership on all this, Rose Dyson and Carolyn Edgar for organizing the evening. Thank you. Austin, behind the scenes, making sure that we can be connected. Thank you very much, Austin, for your help in all this. And David Wilson, I'll say more about David in a few minutes. My topic tonight is a comparison of John A. Macdonald and Egerton Ryerson, seen from the perspective of reformist thought. I'm calling it progressivism. You can call it Victorian progressivism. I'm going to call it Ontario progressivism. I want to make the case that both Egerton Ryerson and John A. Macdonald were progressive individuals and followed a progressive politics. As such, are not good candidates for being thrown on the heap of history, the trash heap of history. I thought I'd start with this, because as I was putting my ideas together for tonight, I said, what if Egerton Ryerson and John A. Macdonald met in 1823, 200 years ago, in the streets of York, the muddy streets of York? What would that have looked like on a rainy May, Tuesday evening, Wednesday evening? What would it look like? Well, this is what you'd have. You'd have a strapping young man, 20 years old, Egerton Ryerson. Imagine this guy. He's been farming all his life. He's a Bible-thumping farmer. Believes in God, believes in his faith, is really inching towards the Methodism of his mother and very much against the Anglicanism of his father. He's a strong young man. He's a farmer. This is him. Engaging again on the farm with such determination and purpose that I plowed every acre of ground for the season, cradled every stalk of wheat, rye, and oats, and mowed every spear of grass, pitched the whole, first on the wagon, and then from the wagon onto the haymow or stack. While the neighbors were astonished at the possibility of one man doing so much work, I neither felt fatigue nor depression. For the joy of the Lord was my strength, both of my body and mind. And I made it nearly, if not quite, as much progress in my studies as I had done while teaching school. This is from the story of my life. This is how he remembers himself at that age. And I think that captures well both the way he remembers things, but it also captures the style of the man, the way he wrote, the way he recollected, the way he remembered his early days, the awakening of his faith, the awakening of his engagement with society. Who's he meeting? Johnny Macdonald's 8 years old. A little kid from Scotland. Egerton Ryerson, born in Ontario, just north of Lake Erie. Strong farmer. Johnny Macdonald, an 8-year-old boy who would not have meant anything to anybody. Trying to work himself away from his Scottish accent, no doubt. Trying to blend in with his family. It would have been a very different kind of meeting, and yet history has made it that these guys were very much aligned. They came from very different perspectives. Egerton Ryerson, the son of an American. Johnny Macdonald, the son of a Scottish refugee. And together, through life, through the 19th century, came to a view that was comparable to each other. They had very few interactions in terms of what we know, in terms of letters that have been left behind. I suspect that they knew each other very much. Upper Canadian society was very small, and the elite was very small. I strongly suspect that they knew each other very well. We don't have a big correspondence between the two, and that's usually a clue that they did know each other, or it could be that they did not know each other at all, and that's possible. We just don't know. But there are instances where they do interact, and I'll talk about that. So I have a few propositions for tonight. Number one is that we have a lot to learn from Ryerson and Macdonald. Both were very different from each other, but both arrive at roughly the same point of progressive thinking. And it's telling that in our time, the memory of both is persecuted at the same time. Well, let's talk about that for a second. How are they being persecuted right now? Well, you've seen the Standing Strong report that came out of Ryerson, and I'm sure that you've noticed that the condemnation of Egerton Ryerson is, at best, practically non-existent. The Standing Strong task force has nothing to say against Egerton Ryerson. The main report is mostly a discussion of politics in the 19th century in Ontario, and not a very good one, I have to say. Egerton Ryerson is weaved in and out, but minimally. There is no understanding of Egerton Ryerson at all. Ryerson is commonly understood and celebrated as the champion of a universal public education system that aimed to create a social cohesion. But the report says it doesn't matter because it's hard to sustain that view of his reformism, given his intolerance for separate schooling for both Indigenous children in the 1830s and 1840s and Black children during his years as a superintendent. That's it. That's the accusation. There's also an appendix. I'm citing the main report here, but there's also an appendix on Egerton Ryerson, a long appendix. And again, there's no condemning sentence. That's it. That's as good as it gets. John A. Macdonald, well, we've been hearing this for a while now, so I'm not going to repeat it, but this article in the National Post of all places, just a few weeks ago, talked about John A. Macdonald. Macdonald, who worked to keep Chinese immigrants from Canada and help the reserve system for Indigenous people in Canada, in addition to being the first Prime Minister. This is how, in a national newspaper, this is how Macdonald is seen. As a man who fought Chinese immigration and as a man who created residential schools. Oh, and he was also Prime Minister for 20 years. By the way, he was also Prime Minister. He's also the key actor in creating Confederation. That's just a trivial detail. All right, so let's talk about the contrast between the two. They were both immortalized in monuments roughly at the same time. Egerton Ryerson a bit before. There was a rash of statues that were erected in the 3 or 4 years after John A. Macdonald passed away in 1891, I'm sorry. Again, there's a lot of parallels in their lives. I'm not gonna recount the whole story of Egerton Ryerson, except to simply summarize the marking events in his life. As I said, he was born in 1803 on the shores of Lake Ontario. Very ordinary schooling. He was obviously very bright, and through his education, is convinced that his mother's Methodism is the way for him to pursue his thinking. He's a good writer. He's a very good writer. He's retained as the editor of the Christian Guardian. He's still in his 20s, and he will be associated with the Christian Guardian for a long, long time. He gets married at the age of 30 for the first time because he spent so much of his years in missionary work. And part of his missionary work was with the Mississauga, where he spent a year working with them, building a church with them, preaching the word to them. This is what he did. He was a Methodist minister to his very marrow. This is what he did. And in those days, that's what the work of missionaries did. That's what it was about. It was about working the fields, working the world. He gets married. He's obviously noticed for his great talents. He's very smart. Goes to London a few times. He'll be going to Europe quite a few times to intervene, to convince London to change its ways, to recognize Methodism as a legitimate presence in the province, as deserving of crown lands or church reserves, as much as the Anglicans. He lobbies effectively. He lobbies to get a charter for the Upper Canada Academy, which will become Victoria College eventually, and the same Victoria College that eventually migrates to the University of Toronto. This is in Cobourg. He lobbies London for protections for Indigenous peoples from British expansionism. This is no small thing. From illegal land occupations. He lobbies London to protect Indigenous land. He'll be involved in the founding of the Aborigines Protection Society. He'll advocate for Kakwa Konabi, that's Peter Jones, excuse my pronunciation, to confirm the Mississauga's legal title to their own reserve lands. This is not trivial. This is using his personal ability to persuade in the service of diplomacy on the other side of the ocean, and at every turn, he's successful. People believe Egerton Ryerson. He's a man of integrity. He's a man who has the ability to convince. He becomes In addition to being the editor of the Christian Guardian, the principal of the Upper Canada Academy, as I said, it'll be upgraded, but when he's there, it's a school. It's nothing more than a high school when he's there originally. But it's a school that's open to girls and boys. It's a high school open to girls and boys. It won't take long. It'll become a college. And at that point, I'm frankly not sure that the girls were allowed to stay. So there are limits to progressivism. We are talking about 1840. Let's not forget. We're not talking 2010. We're talking 1840. This is Victoria College. It still exists in Cobourg. It's still there for you to visit. I think it's a retirement home now. But the bones of the building are still very much intact. Ryerson is recognized. He gets an honorary doctorate from Wesleyan University in Connecticut in 1842. And once Upper Canada becomes Canada West as part of the United Province of Canada, he is naturally seen as the best person to become the chief superintendent of education for Upper Canada. And it'll be a job he'll occupy for 42 years. He'll be going to Europe. Again, he goes to one of the first things he does, and Egerton Ryerson's pretty clever on this, traveling on the public's dime. I have to say, it's kind of admirable the way he's been able to pull that off. But one of the first things he does is go to Europe to understand what's happening in terms of educational reform in Europe and in the United States. He goes to Ireland. He's very much inspired by the Irish in terms of their educational reforms. He'll visit schools in Germany, in Switzerland, in France. He returns and is adamant about a number of things to reform Upper Canada, Upper Canadian society. He wants kids to go to school. He wants school to be free. He wants school to be mandatory. Every kid should have the right to an education. Again, we're talking 1840. We're talking about a pioneer society where people are roughing it to try to earn a living off the land. And if you can have a kid to help you, the kid's going to stay home. He's saying no. For better society, kids need to be educated and young girls need to be educated. Not a small thing. He'll be guiding the educational system. And again, those days, it's very decentralized. And Ryerson's mission will be to try to centralize things, to bring more consistency across the province so that we don't have a patchwork where some kids are educated because their local neighborhood is organized and wealthy, and some other kids are victimized because their neighborhoods are not wealthy. So he's very much into that. In 1850, the Common School Act allows for separate schools. Now, again, this is a recognition of the fact that there are a lot of Catholics in society in Ontario, and because it's a united province with Quebec, Catholic Quebecers want to see their rights being recognized. So we have a system of separate schools. Egerton Ryerson, in his writings, often says it's not the system he would have preferred, but he recognizes society for what it is. And he's willing to moderate himself on that. Yes, the Catholics exist. The Catholics have a right to an education. If they insist that it be a Catholic education, well, so be it, as long as they learn a bunch of other things. President of Victoria College, he's going to be the father of the normal school, because he also believes that teachers should be trained so that we don't leave it to anybody to teach whatever they learn from their parents. There has to be consistency. And again, it's a fight. It's a fight. If you want that, then you need a school. Okay, let's build a school. And he built a normal school, what we call a normal school, which is where Ryerson is currently located. And if you go inside the quad, you'll see the facade of the old building. That was the idea. And that his statue originally stood in front of that building that he created, that school that he founded. Also, a high activist in the public library system. He says we need to have public libraries. Books need to be available. If we want to have an educated society, we should have books. They should be free of charge. People should be able to borrow them. Now, in those days, he attached the libraries to the schools because it made sense. You had an infrastructure. So Ryerson is very much about that. He's named president of the Methodist Church. And one of the best things he did is again, very cleverly being able to use the public's dime. 1855, 57, he went to Europe and acquired 236 paintings, 1,000 casts of sculptures for his new museum in the normal school, because he said, if we want to teach people about culture, Western culture, well, they need to have examples of what it looks like. We don't have the internet. It's the 1850s. I emphasize the 1850s. And he goes shopping. And that will be the founding nut, the heart of the collection that will eventually become the ROM. Now, I wish I could tell you which of these paintings, apparently they're scattered all over the place. And I think there's a wonderful book to be written. Can you imagine Egerton Ryerson coming out of Upper Canada, traveling in Europe in 1855, shopping around for paintings? I think it's absolutely marvelous. He was doing this, I mean, I'm sure he was doing it for his own pleasure. There's no doubt about that. But he had a public purpose in mind, and he delivered. What he wants is a fair society where students, where kids have a right to education. In one of his letters, he refers to the indigenous children as scholars. It's a very touching expression. He calls them scholars. They're little kids in school. But this is a letter about indigenous kids. He calls them scholars. The Ryerson report, the task force mentions a terrible line where he refers to indigenous people as savages. I'm sorry, but that was the common expression in those days. Savages. It's a terrible thing to call people, but savages means people of the wild. And in the 19th century, this is what people called Indians, indigenous people. But, again, I think that you have to be indulgent. This is the way people spoke. We speak a certain way in the 21st century. I think that you have to be a little bit indulgent with those expressions, especially given that they were not abused. It's not like he was referring to them that way all the time. And this is a criticism of Macdonald. I'll come back to that in a second. But that's what he stands for. Consistently demanding that we go beyond religion, that we insist on an education for the kids. And he's consistent about that. And he's also not hiding the fact, he cannot walk away from his missionary soul. He does see education as a Christian building effort. That education goes through the heart of Christianity. And that if a kid goes to school, he's going to learn about the Christian God. He also believes in the British monarchy. You may wonder, where was he in terms of his politics with the 1837 rebellion? Was he on the side of Mackenzie? No. He was strenuously against what William Lyon Mackenzie was up to. He believed in the king. He believed in the monarchy. He believed in the British collection. Even as a Methodist, he was a moderate, willing to work within the empire. And yeah, you can hold that against him. And in the 21st century, maybe that is a legitimate claim. The man defended the British Empire. Well, 99% of the population was loyal to the British Empire. He was not being eccentric in that regard. But a real commitment to civil liberty, a freedom of conscience, a freedom to worship, a freedom to think. That's what Egerton Ryerson was about. Education should be practical, it should be Christian, and it should also be comprehensive. A few quotes, again, drawn from his recollections. If ignorance is an evil to society, voluntary ignorance is a crime against society. No wonder, after he died, people in Ontario thought this man deserved a monument. For 30 years as superintendent, but long before that, he had championed education. He had championed a better Ontario, a better Canada West, a better Upper Canada. Finally gets his wish in 1871 when attendance is compulsory in elementary schools and free. A real victory for himself, a real victory for the province. Free education for any kid. It took him 30 years to make that argument. Why? Because not everybody believes that you should be spending taxes to raise the other guy's kid. It's a massive investment of your dollars for the betterment of society. Not everybody wants that. It's a very demanding ask. Now, the main criticism against Egerton Ryerson is that he wrote a report. The government of Canada, the United Province of Canada, regarding Indigenous people and their education, in particular, with regards to a particular project for a particular kind of school. He was asked by George Warden, the British Assistant Superintendent General of Indian Affairs, for his response, his reaction to the idea of creating a special school, a school where kids would be invited to reside. It would be a residential school where they would learn particular skills. And Varden's letter is very telling, saying, act quickly, please, because the window of opportunity on this is going to close soon. People are not pleased with the idea of tax dollars going towards the education of Indigenous kids. We have a window of opportunity. We need your reaction. We need your better ideas. Please respond quickly. And he'll do that a couple of months later. His report is only a few pages long. It's not really a report. It's a reaction. And he says, yeah, it makes sense to have a residential schools where kids can learn a whole variety of crafts. He's relying on what's already existing in Ontario. As early as 1786, the Mohawks established their own schools. It's not like the Indigenous people don't want to have education. Of course they wanted education. They can see the writing on the wall. They knew that they had to join the mainstream. They had to be familiar with at least what the mainstream was about. If you want to trade, if you want to work with the mainstream, you got to learn how it thinks. 1829, the Mohawk Institute is set up in Brantford. What's it talking about? What is its curriculum? Farming, gardening, and English. In 1834, the Mohawk Institute starts to board students. A boarding school, a residential school for Indigenous kids in Brantford. Egerton Ryerson's not an idiot. He says, yeah, that's working. Maybe we can do more. But in his report of 1847, he says, I got an even better example I found in my travels in Switzerland. The Hofbühl Institute. And they have a really fantastic, progressive curriculum. The kids wake up in the morning because they're learning to be farmers. And I'm sorry, if that offends some people in the 21st century, but the farmers wake up with the cows. And they have to go milk the cows and they have to tend to their fields. That would be part of the education in this residential school for Indigenous kids. Identical with that of every good common school. Reading, writing, arithmetic, plus agriculture, plus mechanics, plus surveying, plus bookkeeping. A very progressive curriculum for Indigenous kids. There's no issue of making attendance mandatory. Of course not. It's voluntary, like everything else in 1847. You couldn't even force your kids to go to school. You couldn't even be forced to send your kids to go to school. Why would they suddenly decide that schooling would be an obligation for Indigenous kids in 1847? It makes absolutely no sense. It was a voluntary thing. It could last 4 to 8 years. There would be a Christian context. Again, he's a missionary. There's no doubt about that. But the state would be minimally involved. A combination of manual work and theory. The government went ahead, but those schools failed. There was not enough support. There's not enough support for them, and they failed. Think of Upper Canada in the 1840s. This is very much a society that is very slowly coagulating. You've got refugees from pretty well everybody. You've got American loyalists. They're still very much there, or they're They're immediate descendants, the second generation of Americans. You've got Scottish refugees, people leaving from the Highlands, kicked off their farms in the Highlands. You've got Irish refugees. You've got French Canadians who are moving into Eastern Ontario because the land in Quebec is simply not producing enough to live on. It's barely a subsistence existence. You've got so many Irish in Toronto that will soon be baptized the Belfast of North America because there are real tensions between the Irish Catholics and the Protestants in Toronto. And this is still, I mean, you guys are all a little bit older than I am, but some of you may remember those tensions. They touched your generation. We're doing a lot better. But in the 1840s, it wasn't pretty. It was a society that was evolving. People learning to work, to live with each other. The indigenous population at that time was 0.8% of the population. I emphasize 0.8. Today, in the very modern 21st century, we accuse people of not paying enough attention to the 0.8% of the population. I think it's really unfair. The vast majority of indigenous people lived in isolated areas, in remote areas, in reserves. Contact with the mainstream was minimal. If it wasn't top of mind, in the spirit of Egerton Ryerson or John A. Macdonald, I think that's understandable. My good friend Donald Smith has written a whole book about how generation after generation and after generation of Canadian leaders have ignored the Indigenous reality. It wasn't invented by Egerton Ryerson or by John A. Macdonald. Let's talk about John A. Macdonald, the second part of this evening. John A. Macdonald, you may know a little bit more about. Scottish boy, born in Glasgow in 1815, immigrates to Canada, apprentices as a lawyer, as you did in those days, gets married around 1843. At the very same time, he catches the eye of business people in Kingston. He's a young lawyer, he's an able lawyer, he's friendly to business. They give him business. They say, hey, John A., why don't you become a councillor in the city of Kingston? In those days, you had an election every year. And John A. said, yeah, why not? He gets elected. Hey, John A., you're doing so well. Why don't you run for the provincial, for the National Assembly, the Assembly of the United Province of Canada? Sure. He gets into national politics in 1844. And by 12 years later, will actually lead the Conservatives, the Conservative Party in Canada, in the United Province of Canada. I'm not going to go very quickly. I mean, you all know the story of his temporary alliance with George Brown, the coalition that will lead the Canadian effort towards Confederation. In 1867, we have Confederation of Canada, and John A. is the Prime Minister. He's elected the Prime Minister of Canada, and he's got a lot of work to do. Setting up departments, bringing together departments from Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, what becomes Quebec and Ontario, forging a national government out of all that, adapting government, creating the Supreme Court, integrating Nova Scotia, because Nova Scotia in 1867 repudiated Confederation. He works hard to reintegrate Nova Scotia, to convince the politicians, I should be more precise. We've got a lot of historians here who are going to take issue with my generalizations. To convince leading Nova Scotian politicians back into the Canadian fold. The acquisition of Rupert's Land, convincing British Columbia to join Confederation, convincing Prince Edward Island to join Confederation. He's a very busy man all through these years. Why is he so successful? Because John A., just like Egerton Ryerson, is a moderate. He understands the politics in the land. He understands that 40% of Canada in 1867 are Catholic. And you cannot be like George Brown, his leader of the leader of the opposition, who's bad-mouthing Catholics left, right, and center. John A. got the potion, and he was successful at it. He was successful all through his life. Now, there are things that he's criticized on. As Attorney General, he did create a law on civilizing Indigenous people. It's a really bad use of words. Basically, what that law was about was to create venues by which Indigenous people could join the mainstream, to make it easier for them to join the mainstream. It was called Civilizing Indigenous People. It's an unfortunate choice of words, but that's, again, the kind of language they used in those days. John A. Macdonald, just like Egerton Ryerson, this horrified people, was in favor of capitalism. He never spoke against capitalism. In his view, capitalism was a good thing. If the state could help capitalists build a country, which is what he did with the CPR, so be it. He wasn't against that. He's always a promoter of capitalists. That was not something to be afraid of. He's in favor of reconciling the English and the French. He's in favor of reconciling the Catholic and the Protestant, reconciling the East and the West. He'll make a statement on numerous occasions all through the 1880s to give women the right to vote. He argues that women should have the right to integrate the power structures of the country. I'm exaggerating a little bit for effect, but at least give them the right to vote. Give them a start. He's in favor of labor. John A. Macdonald will allow for the creation of unions. Mostly to stick it to George Brown, but that doesn't matter. The principle is still there. He was a friend of the worker. John A. Macdonald was a friend of the worker and always a promoter of education, heavily involved in the Kingston infrastructures for education, including the establishment of Queen's University, and remarkably, a champion of public health, another topic that is of particular interest to us today. Now, his reputation, of course, has been trashed over the last 15 years, largely as a result, largely. The kickoff was James Dashup's book, Clearing the Plain. Clearing the Plains made the argument that Canada was guilty of genocide, that Canada was a genocidal country. He didn't actually say that in his book. He said that in the media afterwards. But the effect of this book was electric. It had an enormous impact. I think it's probably the most influential book ever published in Canadian history. And he picked up on a lot of anti-Indigenous sentiment. Again, there's no shortage. There's no shortage. And it was across both sides of the floor. David Mills, Liberal MP, look at his words. John A. Macdonald, 1882. Now, that was a quote taken out of context. You have to understand the way the Canadian government was sending out rations to the people in the West who were facing starvation as a result of the collapse of the buffalo hunt. Because in the 1870s, the buffalo hunt crashed. There's no more food. The whole way of life of the Cree, the Blackfoot, disappeared. And the Indigenous people who had been following these customs for 10,000 years, overnight, it's unimaginable how hard it must have been, had to stop chasing buffalo. It didn't help that the Americans were waiting on the other side with machine guns. And a lot of Indigenous from the United States moved north to Canada. People forget that. But for all his criticism, James Dashup did recognize, in the very opening of his book, but that's always ignored, that the government of Canada was not expecting this to happen. It caught the government of Canada by surprise, just like it caught the Indigenous people by surprise. And the government of Canada did not have the infrastructure necessary to start shipping rations so that the Indigenous people could live. Now imagine the situation. You need to provide food for people to survive. There are no railways. Western Canada is one heck of a hostile place in the wintertime. How much food do you need? Well, there's a whole lot of calculation going on. And it's not just through the winter, because you don't have any food in the spring either, and you don't have any transportation in the spring either. So you got to provide food, enough food in September, October to last till when? April or May? Maybe even June. That's a lot of food. And there's no railway. The railway will be built in 1885, completed in 1885. What does John A. Macdonald do? Well, and by the way, Dashuk, for all his clearing the plain, I actually did the calculation. I actually counted all the dead that he identified. And for all his claims, there are 43 people who died of starvation in the years that John A. Macdonald was prime minister. Okay? And from that, we have terrible language. Now, here's something that's going to surprise you a little bit. This is material that will be coming out in my book on Sir John A., hopefully in the fall. This is an examination of the public accounts, the account, just like today, in which the government tells us how it spent the money. This goes back to 1878, 77, 78, when John A. Macdonald returns to power, to 1889, 1990. I draw your attention to a few things. The biggest expense, of course, is subsidies to the provinces. Things haven't changed, all right? Ottawa is still the cash cow for the provinces. That's the way we're set up. Public works, consistently the second biggest expense. So it's surprising. Canada is building its infrastructure. The militia goes up 1883 to 1885. Well, because there's a good reason for that. You have the Riel insurrection, and the government's going to have to spend a lot of money to suppress it. There's no denying that. Miscellaneous is a whole bunch of other things. You can see that it also spikes in 1885 to 1886. But all through it, the spending on the Department of Indian Affairs is consistent, dramatically responding in 1880, 1881, and consistently growing. This is not the attitude of a government that's hostile to the indigenous people of the country. In fact, the Department of Indian Affairs will be the third biggest expense in the Macdonald government. The third biggest expense. I underline that. Did John A. Macdonald start residential schools? Absolutely he did. And did he use bad language? Yeah, that's the worst one. And it's crude. It's very crude. And I want to be upfront about it, because it's always quoted. Yeah, it's crude. The indigenous people, particularly out west, were dying. They're struggling for food. They need to learn how to farm. They need to learn how to join the mainstream. He could have done nothing. John A. Macdonald and the rest of the government could have done nothing. They'd get the same criticism as they're getting now. He does set up residential schools, but I emphasize, in John A. Macdonald's day, nobody was forced to attend any school. And it was done in response to the indigenous demand for their kids to be educated. Again, it's expensive. Not every band had enough people who were interested in an education. So it was a logical thing to say, well, if we don't have a critical mass in one area, let's group them together and find a way to educate them. Yeah. Were there abuses? Absolutely there were abuses. Nobody can deny that. 150,000 kids attended residential school in 113 years. It's estimated that between 3,000 and 6,000 kids died. We don't know that. That's an estimation based on a whole variety of factors. We don't know it. We think that makes sense because it's roughly comparable to the rest of the population in Canada. Let's not forget that infant mortality was rampant in the 19th century and the early 20th century. We had tuberculosis. We had all sorts of infectious diseases. We didn't have antibiotics. Kids died. I'm looking for a comparison. I think it's going to take a long time to come. But how many people died when John A. Macdonald was prime minister? We absolutely don't know. How many died after that? We don't know that either. We just don't know. But what we do know is that John A. Macdonald was a very successful politician. And I draw your eye to the percentage of the vote that he and his party collected in his lifetime, starting from a paltry 34% in 1867. And if you're interested in 1867, by the way, there's a great book coming out next year on that. And I wrote it. But look at the results here. Again, I read somewhere that getting 50% of the vote when you have a two-party system is nothing to boast about. I completely disagree. There were a lot of different parties in 1867 and 1872, even in 1874. Gradually, all those parties collapsed, and their militants joined the Conservative Party. When 51% of the people vote for the prime minister, and the prime minister carries out policies, I think that a prime minister that has been democratically elected is deserving of some sort of charity, deserving of at least a second look. Did Macdonald and Ryerson get together? As I said earlier, we're not really sure. There are a few letters that exist, and I want to thank Lynn Macdonald for sending these to me. In 1844, Macdonald wrote to Ryerson saying that he was very delighted that Ryerson was now the superintendent of education. 10 years later, Ryerson, responding to the expression of sympathies upon his father's death, said that his father had long appreciated John A. Macdonald. Are they similar in their outlooks? Lord Elgin called Macdonald a moderate conservative. William Lyon Mackenzie said that there was something of the liberal spirit in John A. Macdonald. But I want to draw your attention to Nathaniel Burwash, one of the leaders of the Methodist Church up in Ontario at that point. He'll be the principal of Victoria College at the University of Toronto. And look at the way he knew Egerton Ryerson. Thrown him into the ranks as a political reform, if not revolution. With such an alliance, he had no sympathy. He was thoroughly conservative in his political predilections. It's an interesting contrast. I mean, he's saying that had he been in politics, he would have been a radical, maybe even a revolutionary. But on the other hand, he was a conservative man of the church. How do you reconcile those things? I think it's fairly simple, maybe too simple. I think that they have a common view. Look at this letter from Macdonald to Ryerson in 1861. So we're still 6 years away from Confederation. The idea of Confederation is just now brewing. All true lovers of the country, and among them I reckon you and myself, leave no stone unturned to counteract this last effort of the Grits, and we must look for aid on all sides. It is for concern and assistance that I want the benefit of your presence here. John A. wants Egerton Ryerson to run for office and join his party. I think we can contrive to make the university matter a lever to move Upper Canada from its depths. Let me know by telegraph and you can come back. It can come down. There's a sympathy between the two. I think that they shared a view of Victorian society in Canada that is close to a Victorian progressivism. What do I mean by that? A need to give people a voice, freedom of thought, freedom of action, freedom of mobility, self-fulfillment, a desire for intellect, free trade, middle-class fear of government intervention, independence. These are the things that tie Ryerson and Macdonald together. They're very similar in their outlook to some of the most popular authors of that era. John Stuart Mill, Charles Dickens, Zola, Balzac, Mark Twain, James Thomson, the author of that wonderful poem, City of Dreadful Night, Charlotte Bronte, the reformism that she expresses in Jane Eyre, Charles Bradlaugh and John Bright, two very important quasi-socialist politicians in Britain, Mary Watts, the artist. These are all people who are held as examples of the kind of thinking that both Macdonald and Ryerson shared. Now, and there's a couple of books here that can be books and an article that can be very helpful to you if you're interested. I'm not saying that they had the same ideas entirely, that they shared the integrity of those ideas. It's an area that needs further reflection. It's an area that deserves serious study. PhD studies or really good authors interested in exploring the relationship between Victorian reformist ideas The ideas of trying to bring society together, to find ways for elements of society to work together, this concern for social solidarity. I think that there's enough people that those two certainly shared that kind of idea. I see them both as two outsider insiders. They're both outsiders. Ryerson the Methodist, Ryerson the son of an American, Johnny Macdonald the son of a Scottish refugee. They're both from the outside, but they're trying to work from the inside to get things done, and they get things done. Their view is progressive and conservative. Johnny Macdonald will campaign on a liberal conservative ticket. He'll always consider himself a liberal conservative. Regrettably, these two progressives have shared the same fate. Why is that? I'm going to finish on this because I think society has lost track of how to think historically. And I'm relying here on the Historical Thinking Project. These are not my ideas. This is a great group of people based in British Columbia who actually work to define what it is to think historically. Establish historical significance, use primary evidence, identify continuity and change. You see continuity and change in Macdonald and Ryerson. You try to analyze cause and consequence. Did Egerton Ryerson's 4-page letter to Varden really cause Indigenous residential schools? No. Did Macdonald's establishment of residential schools lead to the perceived genocide? I think the question remains open. You have to take historical perspectives. You have to understand people in their context. You can still be critical. Everybody can be critical. We have a right to be critical of actors in our past. There's nothing wrong with that. It's a lot of fun, in fact. But you have to be respectful of the context. You have to think about how society evolves. And necessarily, it evolves through our leadership. The people that we elect are called upon to lead the way, to find better ways of improving society. That is their task in a democratic society like ours. And we have a duty, I hold, to recognize those people, to make sure that they are understood. They took the chance. They took a chance. They could have done nothing. I emphasize, they could have done nothing. They took a chance. Neither one was rich. Neither one of them, died rich. But they took a chance in challenging public opinion and were recognized for their leadership because they did manage to convince people. And I think that their words are well worth hearing. Their desire for solidarity, for a better society, based on a common experience of education, both Macdonald and Ryerson, are eminently worth remembering. Ryerson was criticized for being a Prussian, for being a Tsar, for demanding a centralization of educational policy. He couldn't do everything. It's not like today where the province pools money and gives it back to school boards. It wasn't like that. You had to pay through municipal taxes. You had to convince people to pay their taxes. And even after that, maybe you had some money to donate. But it was all very decentralized, and Ryerson wanted to change that. As for Macdonald, there's absolutely no evidence that he held any views that were in any way offensive to Indigenous people in his day. He also made the argument that Canada was a country worth building, that there was nothing that prevented us from creating a better country, to convince his contemporaries that Canada was a noble experiment worth defending and something that we should all remember and encourage on politicians to resist to temptation to abide by what the Vandals are getting away with. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Patrice. That was very interesting and informative. And I, for one, am going to be looking forward to your book.
I hope I wasn't too frenzied.
We'll now hear from David Wilson. David is a professor in the Celtic Studies program and the History Department at the University of Toronto, and the general editor of the Dictionary of Canadian Biography, a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, and a recipient of the University of Toronto's Outstanding Teaching Award. He has written and edited 12 books, including a prize-winning 2-volume biography of Thomas D'Arcy McGee, and most recently, Canadian Spy Story, Irish Revolutionaries and the Secret Police. David.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the invitation. I'm not going to detain you for very long. I was probably talk for about 10 or 15 minutes, and I'd like to pick up on some of the general points that Patrice left you with. I'd like to make some general reflections about the place of presentism and the role of ethics and morality in the way we approach history. And my starting point is not Canadian, but Irish, and specifically the words of the great historian from Queen's University Belfast, A.T.Q. Stewart. Writing during the Troubles of Northern Ireland, he had first-hand experience of the ways in which history was being used to promote political agendas for partisan purposes. A process where people grab rocks from the past to hurl at their opponents on the opposite side of the wall. A.T.Q. Stewart also had no illusions about the challenges involved in cutting through popular myths of the past. This is from the last chapter of the last book he wrote in 2001, and it's a threnody for the historical profession. The past is dead, and nothing that we choose to believe about it can either harm or benefit those who are alive in it. On the other hand, it has the power to harm us. There are many people of good intentions who would persuade us that if only we could discover the truth about our history, some of that harm might be neutralized. This is an illusion, for the myth is often more potent than the reality, and perhaps a different kind of truth. History is not a branch of social welfare, and the only respectable motive for studying it is to explore the past for its own sake. Academic historians must resign themselves to the fact that they have little real influence on a nation's view of its past. The reality, which is disinterred by patient scholarship, is not so much disputed as simply ignored. A.T.Q. Stewart, writing in 2001. There is, I fear, much validity in this assessment. I'd like to pick up, though, on what I think is the key sentence. History is not a branch of social welfare, and the only respectable motive for studying it is to explore the past for its own sake. This is not something that I would suggest my graduate students should ever put on their grant applications, believe me. The statement could be viewed as a retreat into perpetual pessimism, but I take a rather different meaning from it. And it's actually quite similar to some of the points Patrice was making at the very end of his talk. What I take from Stewart's comments is that above all, the historian's task is to understand the past, based on the best available evidence, based on sound reasoning, based on imaginative insight, characterized by a sense of humility and conveyed with clarity. Now, as historians such as E.H. Carr pointed out long ago, the selection and the arrangement and the evaluation of that evidence is influenced by the personality and the background of the historian who's dealing with it. It's influenced by the time in which he or she lived and by the questions that are asked. And I would add here that history is often portrayed as a story. In fact, the word is in the title of my most recent book. But it's not really a story, it's an inquiry. And the nature of that inquiry depends on the questions that are being asked and who's asking them and when they are being asked. Objectivity is impossible. We strive for truth, even as we realize that it can never be fully attained. But as Carlo Ginzburg put it, once truth is taken out of the equation, the whole enterprise collapses. It does not follow from these observations, I think, that historians should never engage in public debate, that they should remain neutral about everything. Apart from anything else, such a stance is untenable, indeed impossible. We inescapably make moral judgments about our subject matter, even as we recognize, or should recognize, that we must try to understand the past on its own terms, as Patrice has done this evening. Currently, I'm reading a PhD thesis that examines, among other things, propaganda campaigns in the Confederate South just before the Civil War. The graduate student who's writing it has presented a fair-minded and non-judgmental analysis of how these propaganda campaigns used by groups in the Confederate South worked and what kind of content they had, stressing the economic importance of slavery to the South, raising the status of poor whites above enslaved people, emphasizing the racial purity of the white South, arguing that slavery was good for slaves, and so on. It is impossible for me to read this without my blood boiling. But I also feel the need to put myself in the position of the people who produced this propaganda and to understand the society and the culture and the history that formed them, and indeed to ask myself whether I would not have shared all these views had I been born at a different time in a different place. Understanding is essential, but it should not, indeed cannot, preclude moral judgment or political engagement. On the contrary, the deeper and the wider the understanding, the greater the case for effective political engagement. But then we come to the question of myths, and A.T.Q. Stewart's view that we must resign ourselves to the fact, as he put it, that we have little real influence over a nation's view of the past. Okay, we have the myth of Egerton Ryerson as the architect of the oppressive and non-Indigenous controlled residential school system. We have the myth of Henry Dundas as the perpetuator of the slave trade. And we have the myth of John A. Macdonald as a genocidal leader of a genocidal nation. But these are not simply popular myths. They have seeped in to the Canadian historical profession. As the Canadian Historical Association's Canada Day statement of 2021 demonstrates, and I quote from the CHA here, "The Canadian Historical Association, which represents 650 professional historians from across the country, including the main experts on the long history of violence and dispossession Indigenous peoples experienced in what is today Canada, recognizes that this history fully warrants our use of the word genocide." All right, that can be debated and should be debated. Debate and diversity, after all, are part of the lifeblood of historical analysis and interpretation. And a robust discussion of the CHA statement was to be expected and welcomed, and to be conducted insofar as it's possible in a calm and reasonable manner on both sides. Around 60 historians signed an open letter protesting against the statement. They included Don Smith, who's written an excellent piece on Egerton Ryerson in Ontario history. They included Jim Miller, who has written part of the revised Dictionary of Canadian Biography entry on John A. Macdonald. And they include Patrice Dutil himself. What is particularly disturbing, though, was the CHA's response to the open letter. Instead of embracing debate, the CHA doubled down and countered with ad hominem attacks on the signatories. They're old. Strike one. They're not experts on Indigenous history. Jim Miller? Don Smith? Strike two, apparently. They published their letter in the Dorchester Review. Oh, therefore nothing in the letter should be taken seriously? Is that the position we have here? Everything but a sustained engagement with their actual arguments. This does not augur well for the future. Nor does the fact that almost all the students in my graduate seminar on Ireland, Race and Empires, which strayed into the territory of residential schools through the work of Nicholas Flood Davin, Irishman who authored a major report arguing for such schools. Almost all the students in that graduate seminar, and they're a very bright group of people, almost all of them agreed with the response, the CHA's response to the open letter. This is disheartening. All of which is to say that anyone who attempts to challenge the demonization of Ryerson, Dundas, and Macdonald has a very steep hill to climb, with the possibility of a good mauling as they go. They will also run the risk of being caricatured as apologists for everything that these men said and did, of being tarred with the brush of racism and coming up against a wall of absolute self-righteous moral certainty. It may be true that at the end of the day, they would have, quote, little real influence, as A.T.Q. Stewart believes. Nevertheless, it would be a case of la trahison des clercs, treason of the intellectuals, to give up and do nothing. And who knows, by highlighting the arguments of historians such as Don Smith on Egerton Ryerson, Nick Rogers on Henry Dundas, and Patrice Dutil on John A. Macdonald, it might well be possible to change some minds along the way. The effort is certainly well worth making, and for that, the friends of Egerton Ryerson deserve applause and admiration. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, David. That was very interesting and thought-provoking. In listening to both you, Patrice and David, I get the impression that it's not only the legacy of John A. Macdonald and Egerton Ryerson that is being questioned and vilified and challenged, but the concept of colonialism itself. Now, how do you reckon that with your students, or reconcile that?
Well, it's a good question, and we discuss colonialism in its many aspects. I don't go into class with a particular agenda on that issue. So the key thing for me would be to see how colonialism operates. First of all, how is it being defined, which is a crucial question. It's being used very loosely. A lot of words are being thrown around very loosely, in fact, but it's used very loosely to describe basically any group of people or nation or ethnic community that has a degree of power and influence over another. It's being used in such a diffuse way that it's actually becoming emptied of its meaning. So I would try and study it not as an abstraction, but look at how power relationships work in specific contexts at specific times. I would also say that words such as colonialism and imperialism cannot be neutral. I mean, there's a set of assumptions and values and beliefs that become associated with the words colonialism and imperialism. It's important, I think, to understand how it operates, and as historians, yes, get that understanding, but then as individuals outside the study of history, to say what we think about the situation in specific circumstances. And I could give you several examples, but I should probably hold off on that. But there may be cases when it's beneficial. There may be cases when its consequences are malign. In fact, there are definitely such cases. There are definitely such cases both ways. What sort of criteria do you use to make that balance? Again, you have to look at specific situations. You have to look at events on a case-by-case basis, the context of the time, and make your assessment then.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
I agree with what you're saying, David, but at the same time, I don't think that we can run away from the reality of colonialism.
I'm not saying that we should. Yeah.
Because colonialism did happen. The British did have a colonial effort in North America. There was a colonial effort. It was undeniably the imposition of a foreign presence on the continent. It rivaled the French. It rivaled the Spanish. It rivaled the Portuguese. Colonialism was a reality. But what my view on this is that it's not even an interesting problem. Colonialism happened. Yeah, we can argue about the mechanisms, the government policies, the impact of this, the impact of that. But I think that in the Canadian context, what's also interesting, and for my mind even more interesting, is how colonialism was challenged from within. How English Canada, through the leadership of people like Ryerson and people like Macdonald, challenged the British government in its colonialism. How the French Canadians challenged the colonialism of the British Empire within a generation. The French Canadians were demanding elections, were demanding a democratic forum to express their views. And I think that, I think that I'm reflecting on the old professors who taught me 40 years ago. That was the interesting story. And maybe as I speak, as I say these words, I'm remembering their words. That's what's interesting. Colonialism happened. Yes, absolutely. Was it bad? Well, we can talk about it. Was it bad? As you say, was it bad? But I think that the real interesting story, and I think this is where we have to challenge our students, is get into the details and let's examine how there's been resistance to the British colonialism, how the story of Canada was in fact a story of colony to nation. And let's not forget that grand narrative, because it's a good narrative. It's a very telling narrative for our particular story. So I'm just saying, I'm not willing to let go. I accept colonialism. It's a reality.
Thank you. Okay, let's open this up to questions from the audience. Anybody? Yeah. Go ahead, Bruce.
Question. Professor Dutil, have you had much of a chance to compare the Indigenous people in the United States with the history in Canada? And I recognize that probably the major difference was the flood of population in the United States was so dramatic, pushing the Indigenous people west. But the movies we grew up of the Indian Wars, for the most part, did not happen in Canada, aside from Winnipeg and 707 in Badosh. Have you had much of a chance to look at the history?
It's not an area in which I'm trained or specialized in, but in a book that I'm expecting to be published later this year, I was struck by the reality of Indigenous migration north of the border as they escaped the American army. There's terrible, terrible, terrible things happened in the United States in the 1870s and 1880s and into the 1890s. Terrible things happened. And many of the tribes, the Crees that had come south to chase the buffalo, stayed in the States for a while. The weather's a little bit better. And as the American army moved, they moved north. And not only for good reasons. A, they had to escape for their lives. And B, there was food. Canada hosted a lot of Indigenous people in that period of 1870, 1880. Historians aren't talking about that, but that's a reality. I'm not sure I've answered your question. David, you want
Well, I think that's fair enough. Cree and the Blackfoot certainly did move north in the 1870s and 1880s. This is the whoop-up period in the American West. It really is the Wild West in this period. And alcohol is used as a weapon to dispossess indigenous peoples of their property. The American army is coming in. I think life is very tough for indigenous peoples on both sides of the border. But there was a movement northwards, absolutely, and it was driven in part by fear of the American army and in part by a desperate attempt to get food. And I think you're quite right to emphasize the collapse of the buffalo economy, and because that was absolutely central. And you're quite right to emphasize the lack of infrastructure. And we have similar discussions about in different contexts about the Irish famine.
Yes,
and British policies.
Was it a genocide?
According to my students, no, which is interesting. But I would argue no. In fact, I think genocide is another one of these words that has come to mean so much that it's in danger of not meaning anything at all. And this really, really troubles me. I mean, when I think of genocide, I think of Hitler. I think of Stalin in Ukraine. Ataturk. I think of Pol Pot, although theoretically that wouldn't fit the UN definition, but that's what I think of. And if you're going to use that word to describe John A. Macdonald, something is seriously wrong here, in my view. So I have now the expression cultural genocide is used a lot. It's become a synonym for aggressive assimilation. And Jim Miller, actually, in the revision to the John A. Macdonald biography that we're doing at the DCB, uses the terms interchangeably, which is interesting because Jim is one of the signatories against the CHA's statement. But I have some misgivings about the use of the phrase cultural genocide. I mean, if it means aggressive assimilation and that's it, I can accept that. But the word itself is so tied to the Holocaust, and what happened in Canada was so unlike the Holocaust. I have some misgivings about the phrase myself.
Okay, yes. Well, we have another question.
That's a question.
Yeah.
We'll go with
Ladies first.
the woman in the blue first.
Daniel, I'm really struck by the demographic divide here, and I've been to several of these meetings, and it is very much a generational difference. And David, you say about your graduate class sounds a little bit discouraging. I'm wondering about you, Patrice. I guess you're teaching undergrads at TMU. Can you say the kind of things you said to us, to your classes? And if you do, what's the reaction?
I have the distinct advantage of not teaching history, you see. Though I am trained as a historian and I write history, I teach politics, public administration. So this kind of topic doesn't really come up, honestly, in my class. But there have been instances, for example, because I taught for many years the introduction to political science in those days it was Ryerson, and I would describe the Queen and trying to describe the constitutional monarchy, which is our system, and I would actually ask students in a secret poll. I would very cleverly use technology. I try to use technology, be hip. I'm a hip guy, and I would ask students, should we retain the monarchy? And you have to recognize how Toronto Metropolitan University is multi-ethnic. It is deeply, deeply multi-ethnic. And my gosh, 60%, 65% voted to retain the monarchy. Isn't that amazing?
Very interesting.
Isn't that amazing? They were voting secretly, okay? They're voting secretly. And they were in favor of the monarch. Now, maybe it's because I made a good case for Queen Elizabeth, and maybe that might be a factor. And I talked about how she has a French quote on her coat of arms. You know that it's in French. It's all in French. So that's got to be a good thing, right? Even though it dates from the 1300s. Anyway, I made a case. I think and that was fairly consistent over the years. Now, So to answer your question, Jan, no, I don't have the same experience as David and Mike. When I teach graduate studies, I teach budget politics, so it's not the same thing. But Ron, I mean, you're teaching the same group. What's your reaction? What happens at TMU when you raise those topics?
Interesting, when I raised Egerton Ryerson or John A. Macdonald, most people don't have
About anything?
anything about it.
Yeah.
They talk about residential schools, they've sort of heard about it. So, you've got on the one hand, a gut reaction that some people have, but most people it just doesn't.
Right. Let's pick up on that because one of my colleagues at the DCB has been doing some part-time teaching at York, teaching business history, and he's come back with the identical reports that most people don't know very much about this and actually don't care very much about it either. That's not my experience at the U of T, but my experience at the U of T is very narrow. It's dealing with graduate students. And in that sense, there is a demographic divide, a generational divide, and I think that's apparent in the Canada Day statement that most of the historians who wrote that are sort of young mid-career historians, and their dismissal of their opponents as old is very revealing.
It's very hurtful.
Well, it is.
It's very
Yes, it is demeaning. Absolutely.
And I'm young.
I would say this pattern of generational divisions is a recurring one. Look, I was part of this myself as a young student at the University of York in England in the late 60s and early 70s, when we were rebelling against political history, and we were very much in favor of E.P. Thompson and the making of the English working class, and bringing the working classes into the historical record. This was one of our missions, much to the discomfiture of some of our older colleagues. And the same thing is now happening to that generation on the part of another one. And this will change. In 30 or 40 or 50 years, there'll be a rebellion against the rebellion that's going on now. I have no doubt about that. I won't be around to see it, but I have no doubt it's going to happen. I would say also just one thing about teaching in class. I know, Patrice, that you made a very strong case for Queen Elizabeth in your class. I wouldn't do that in mine, not because I'm not because I'm a rabid Republican or anything like that, because I'm agnostic on that issue. But I honestly don't think it's my job as an historian to promote a line in my classes. I will ask students what they think about the reading, and then I will interrogate them about it as much as possible and try and draw out contradictions and tensions if such exist, and try and make them think more clearly. I'm trying to make myself think more clearly about the material that we're dealing with. And in that seminar, where the students all supported the response to the open letter, and indeed this Canada Day statement itself, I mean, after prolonged discussion, there was an agreement that a debate over genocide was in some senses missing the point, that the key point was to try and ascertain what kind of experiences Indigenous peoples actually had in the West in the 1880s, and what the government responses were, and not to get so caught up in the language. Of course, on the other hand, the language is really important, and it can't be dismissed either. But there was some movement at any rate.
Yeah, good. Okay, Ned and then Peter. Yeah,
Yep.
go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
My experience is that in the university, the wokeness, if you want to call it, this reinterpretation of history is coming out of the social sciences, particularly students who are in social work and programs like that. They are the ones who have been exposed by the people teaching them to these ideas. And they are the most vocal in this.
Mhm.
And in history, I would say, they may have some vague idea, but it doesn't mean anything. And like you, I don't try and push a line.
I don't either, by the way, just to make sure.
Okay, all right. Only with Queen Elizabeth.
No, not even that.
I'm kidding.
My job is to present both sides.
Pierre
Present both sides.
Belway really likes Queen Elizabeth.
Okay.
I thought for John Macdonald's quote.
Okay,
The ROM, it was a very good exhibit of, think indigenous art. And his quote about, you'll have a savage that can be, take another crack at explaining that.
my question.
Thank you for the question. This was common language. And it's common language until fairly recently. Referring to the indigenous people as savages is within your generation. This was common language in the 19th century, and Macdonald used it. But at the same time, for every quote that can be pulled out with him using those words, I can show you another quote where he is eminently respectful of indigenous people, eminently respectful. And I make a real effort in my book to bring those out. So it's toe for toe. It's toe to toe. I mean, but he used that language. And he was born in 1815. That's the kind of language they used.
Okay, Austin's trying to signal something to me. There's,
Oh, we have a message from Don Cranston.
okay. Shall we take that? And then we'll go to Peter. I think he's had his hand up the longest so far.
Can Don Cranston?
As a messenger, I see Gordon Walker has actually been waving his physical hand, so.
Oh,
Or to Gordon, actually.
okay. Well, we can't see physical hands.
Go.
Go, Gordon.
Okay, Gordon.
He's muted.
Are you unmuted now, Gordon?
He has no hands and he's muted.
All right. Okay.
Actually, you can.
While we're waiting for Gordon, maybe we'll take Peter's
Gordon,
question.
raise your hand so you can be seen, and our technician can unlock you.
Raise hand feature.
Raise hand feature. Can you use your raise hand feature? We don't see you.
Okay.
If you can unmute yourself, Gordon, we'll answer your question. But we can.
Let's take Peter. Peter Venton.
Well, I'd like to congratulate both speakers. They're really impressive. The two things that struck me is the role of the historian helpful developing definitions, particularly of progressivism and colonialism. My ulterior motive is I'm an economist and I'm studying colonialism in the context of economic theory through Marx, Keynes, and so on. So the problem is with the definition of progressivism. I think I got an awful lot better feel for it from the historians.
Get to the chat. Is there a mouse or something?
I think one of the comments was that we still haven't got it's a good definition.
Yeah, the mouse.
We should. Anyway.
Yeah.
Thank you. Very interesting presentation.
If I can answer that first. Yeah.
One of the things that I think I'm not sure whether Margaret Milne had this criticism, but the criticism was that we shouldn't bring in economic analysis into history or words to that effect. And I think that you have to do that in order to get sort of complete historical analysis.
First of all, I want to thank David for not upbraiding me on my loose use of the word progressivism. And it just goes to show what a gentleman he is. I mean, I always respect his lines and his words. And again, he's demonstrated how kind he is tonight. I'm using the word progressivism loosely here. I admit to that. Okay, I haven't published anything on this. The idea of Victorian progressivism is actually something I created last week. I'm trying to be convincing. There's Gordon Walker when you see him.
Yes, okay.
But here's my defense. There is such a thing. I use progressivism in the sense that it is an amalgam of conservatism and reformist thinking. It's sort of a midpoint. Just like the American progressives were, the American progressives who really come into their own in the 1890s, and in fact, the Canadian progressives on the English side and on the French side. On the English side, you know progressivism as the social gospel. And to my mind, Egerton Ryerson was a proto-social gospeler. A guy who, in the words of Nathaniel Burwash, probably would have been a CCFer. And like most CCFers of the first generation, thought in terms of race, thought in terms of, I had really harsh things to say about Indigenous people, far more than Egerton Ryerson ever did. But that's how I see them. And you sort of have to position the progressives in terms of what the British, because this is the link, it's British. I'm associating it with the reformist thinking of the French novelists in the later half of the 19th century, Zola, Hugo, those kinds of people. But there's a whole bunch of English reformists who are pushing the edge of the envelope, who are saying that the capitalist system that we have is creating too many victims. There has to be a role for the church. There has to be a role for the state. And they are militating to change minds. And I think that if Egerton Ryerson had lived longer, he would have been that way. The way I read his pleas for social solidarity, for me, associates him with the movement of progressivism that will happen after he dies, after he disappears. Now, I'm also saying that about Macdonald, and this is my view of Macdonald. I see him as far more progressive than the vast majority of his contemporaries. His views on Indigenous people, his views on French Canadians, his views on Catholics. David's written a wonderful book on how Macdonald cleverly used aspiring to infiltrate the Fenians. And David makes the case that Macdonald could have used this for electoral purposes and made hay out of it. He could have targeted the Catholics. He didn't. He didn't. Why? Because there was a greater good, a greater solidarity, social solidarity at stake. Why go and somehow vilify 40% of the population and wreck the potential for the country? He had nothing to gain from it. He's politically astute, again, the most astute man of his generation by far, and he managed.
Okay, good.
Dave.
I think we got Gordon now unmuted. Go ahead, Gordon.
Thank you. I think you can hear me. Am I correct?
Yep.
Wonderful. Very interesting discussion here. And one of the interesting words I want to return to, and very fortunately in the time that it took to raise my hand and get unmuted, part of it was answered. And that relates to this whole question of savages, the word. And while the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is relatively soft, so to speak, on criticism of Macdonald, the one thing that's almost overwhelming is that within the first 10 lines of the TNRC is the word, quoting Macdonald, saying they are savages. Now, my question is, and I think I heard you say it, that both of you are saying, David and Patrice, you're both saying that savages was in common parlance at that time, and indeed may even been for many, many years after that. Did savages mean exactly what we think today savages probably means? Or is it a somewhat different interpretation, rather loosely used to be fairly generic? Because if you get Macdonald on the one hand saying the word savages, and in the next paragraph, he talks very kindly about the wonderful Indigenous people, you wonder just how there could be such a gap between those two phrases. So could either of you and both of you maybe focus on that word savages and how strong was that parlance back then?
Go ahead, David.
Okay. I suspect, Patrice, thank you. It's a very good question. And behind it lies a major question that we deal with as historians, and that's the strangeness of the familiar, that words change their meanings. Absolutely. In this case, and I suspect Patrice and I will disagree, in this case, I think savages in the context of the 19th century did have very negative connotations. That it was language used by a culture that viewed itself as superior towards people it regarded as being an inferior culture. Now, in Macdonald's case, I don't think that's the same as racism, actually. I think if you're looking for racism in Macdonald, you'll find it. You'll find it in his attitude to the Chinese. In fact, I think this is an instance where he was more racist than many of his contemporaries when it came to the Chinese. But his view, as I see it, of indigenous peoples is that, particularly in the West, they were culturally inferior. In the East, it's very interesting. I'd like to know, Patrice, how many of the examples of positive comments you've gathered about Macdonald come from Ontario, because he had very good relations with Indigenous communities in Ontario. But he didn't know the West as well, and he clearly, at several stages, feared that there was going to be there was a potential for a major uprising of Indigenous peoples, particularly around the Riel resistance of 1885. So I think there's much more hostility to Indigenous peoples in the West in his part, and I suspect a greater propensity to use the word savages towards them rather than the relatively, quote, civilized, unquote, Indigenous peoples in the East. I'd love to get your sense of that, Patrice.
Austin, should I turn this to myself or? Look, there is no disputing the fact that Canadian society was hostile to Indigenous people, that Canadian society discriminated against Indigenous people. I mean, I take that as a given. Like everywhere else. Canadians aren't better than anybody else. We're racist. There's racism all the time. I think there's a good question of comparisons that we need to discuss as historians, but that's another matter. Savages was a common expression. The idea that they were uncivilized is a common expression. And what they meant by that, it was disparaging. I'm not disputing that. But it was also a statement of the fact that Indigenous people were very different, that they did favor a style of life, a lifestyle that was different than the mainstream. And a lot of people had trouble with that. And so you have efforts to try to get people into the mainstream, to educate people, Indigenous people, so that they can join the mainstream. The perception in the 19th century and well into the 20th century was that Indigenous people were on the way out. Mm-hmm. Their numbers were declining for all sorts of reasons. Their numbers were declining. That changed only in the 1960s, 1970s. So I think there was a general prejudice in Canadian society against Indigenous people. I don't think that the elite held such views to the same degree. That's my perception. There is an origin to the word sauvage that we have to understand, and I think it's still worth being reminded of it. You know, Champlain in his first accounts of the Indigenous referred to them as sauvage. What did he mean by that? These are, in French, sauvage means somebody who's wild, of the wild, living in the wild. For a guy like Champlain, coming to the shores of the St. Lawrence, seeing these people living in the wild, well, ils sont sauvages. They live in the wild. It's a normal expression. My mother called my sisters little sauvage because they were very, ill-mannered girls. They're little sauvage, little savages. But it's not. I'm just joking. But it's not a laughing matter. It's a reality. I think prejudice was a reality. It was used disparagingly. I accept that. But there's still an element there. in the minds of people that referring to indigenous people as savages was a statement of the fact that they still lived in the wild. They lived in remote areas in the wild, away from the mainstream.
Okay, thank you for that, Gordon. And I think Gilbert is next. Gilbert.
Okay, I'd like to go back to the 1840s when Ryerson was asked to write the little note about industrial schools, as he called them. There was a meeting of the chiefs with the government a year before, July, and I think here we see something because we see the native chiefs actually articulating the crisis they're in. They realize their demography is collapsing. They realize that they're threatened with physical extinction. And their answer, often in many of the speeches, is to say, we have to break the link in our culture between the way we live now and the way we must live to survive. They were saying, in fact, very much what Macdonald and others saying, that you had to break the link in the families and the traditions and create new traditions and new ways of life and new rhythms of work and new attitudes to fun. And they saw that that was going to be very painful and very difficult. And when you look at the minutes of that meeting, you see the native leaders and the natives themselves were not just objects of action by us, the colonialists or the settlers. They were also very, very active protagonists trying to find a solution. And Ryerson's statement was very much in line with what they wanted, and they articulated very clearly.
I agree completely, Gilbert, and I would say you can extend that to the indigenous people in the West who, in their negotiations of the numbered treaties, also asked for schools.
And they also asked, in fact, for residential schools often because they wanted, sounds very cruel, but the chiefs realized they had to break familial links in many ways if the new way of life was going to be embraced and successful.
It's a reality.
Now this is a crucial problem of physical survival and cultural survival.
And again, we have evidence that Macdonald consistently said this is not to be mandatory. It's whoever wants to send their kids to school. It's not mandatory. That came later. That's for other prime ministers to be demonized later. Their statues will be coming down soon.
Yeah, I think the general point you make, Gilbert, is a very important one. The question of agency, because in the sort of historical cultural studies view that we have, and by the way, we need economic history, but in the cultural history is sort of taken over from economic history. We need to redress that imbalance. But in the current sort of dominant historical view, I think the emphasis on Indigenous peoples as victims, which is entirely understandable and in some ways justified, perhaps in many ways justified, nevertheless discounts the degree of agency that they had right back from the time of Champlain and negotiating alliances with European powers in their own internal struggles. So I think that's a very important question indeed. My sense, I'm not as au fait with this as you are, Patrice. So correct me if I'm wrong. My sense is that Indigenous leaders such as Kakwa, Peter Jones, wanted very much to work with Egerton Ryerson. There were divisions, I think, in the Indigenous communities about the extent to which that should take place, but a significant element wanted exactly what you said, or I think perhaps almost exactly what you said, because my sense is they wanted control over these schools themselves, which they did not get with the residential school system that came up in the 1880s.
I think that at the meeting, it's very interesting, and I think probably of Egerton Ryerson's intent, but certainly at the meeting in July 1846, the intent was expressed that the Indigenous people would become the leaders of the schools fairly quickly.
Yes, right, yeah.
Okay, yes.
Wanted to make 2 points. One, the use of the word savage, I would think, should be understood in the context of the Romantic movement, which was alive and well in the part of the 19th century. And this perhaps portrayed the idea there was that Aboriginal people were part of what was seen as a very positive set of relations with
The noble savage.
with nature. Yeah, so that's one point. Second point is this, and this is a more difficult question to frame, but much of the discussion has centered on the power relations after contact between Europeans and Aboriginal peoples. Are there reliable historical accounts of power relations pre-contact amongst the Aboriginal people? And if so, are there qualitative differences between those two sets of power relations?
You want to go ahead?
Sure. To take your first point, yes. I mean, there are clearly many examples of that. Particularly the ones I know of are from the late 18th and early 19th century, which was sort of the Rousseauist movement and the oneness with nature and so on that you get. I'm not. I don't think John A. Macdonald had a romantic bone in his body, however, so I would not think that would apply to
I
him.
disagree vehemently.
Well, when it comes
Let's have
to
a fight.
okay, when it comes to romantic views of peoples, I don't think so. Romantic, personally, perhaps, but on the question of power relations, yeah, actually, James Dashok's book has some very interesting material on that in the early chapters. Archaeological evidence in that is connected to climatic changes, for example, and the disruption of food supplies and the movement of indigenous peoples and entire communities being wiped out by other communities of indigenous peoples. But in the quest for control over diminishing resources. But I think the most significant difference that occurred with the entrance of Europeans and the beginnings of colonialism were the weapons that indigenous peoples now had, or very quickly acquired. So the scale of violence in indigenous warfare increased dramatically, exponentially, really. And I think that was a fundamental difference and a very destructive difference. That plus which I would also mention, the introduction of alcohol, which had absolutely, and of course disease above all, but disease, alcohol, and guns had such devastating consequences for indigenous peoples.
And it's worth pointing out that John A. Macdonald made every effort to make sure that alcohol was not imported into the country, into the West, that indigenous people were, and working with indigenous leaders, they were asking for it, making sure that the alcohol trade was minimized in this country. But the rest of it, I mean, is highly speculative. You're asking a question about what do we know about indigenous warfare pre-contact, and the reality is that it's at best speculative.
Yep.
We don't have a written record. There is an oral record, but the oral record is highly unreliable. And what we're getting is basically what a few Frenchmen collected based on their interviews with indigenous people, which was, I'm sure, full of misunderstanding. They can be helpful a little bit, but it's all speculative. And we only know maybe one generation pre-contact. After that, it's entirely speculative, and I don't trust it. I mean, it could be, they can do a whole bunch of things and measure the rings on trees and whatever else to determine what climatic conditions were, but it's all highly speculative. But to bring back to Dashok, though, he makes quite a compelling case that disease wiped out most of the indigenous people, that what the Europeans brought was germs, and that had a devastating impact. Beyond that, we have speculations that, there were 60 million indigenous people in the Americas. We have estimates of 5 million people across the Americas. We don't know. We just don't know.
Yeah.
And I think that, it's fun to speculate, and it's fun to think about, and it's fun to look at various methods that have been used to come to some determination, but we just don't know. The reality is we just don't know.
Okay, we got time for one more question, quick question, and then I think we have to be out of here in about 5 or 10 minutes, right?
Curtain comes down.
Okay,
Yeah,
go
so-
ahead. Yeah,
Did you have a question?
yes,
Yeah.
yes, one more question.
We're good. My name is Rick Fee. To make a quote to begin with. Or heathen lands afar, thick darkness broodeth yet, arise, O morning star, arise and never set. A hymn that was likely sung by every one of the men you've talked about in Anglicanism, Presbyterianism, and
Methodism. Methodism.
Methodism. So savage and heathen. Put them together. Then you have the dynamic, and I like your development of John and Macdonald. The Scots were considered savages, but
Absolutely,
we should not forget
absolutely.
the role that John and Macdonald played as a Scotsman in all of this mix. He was Presbyterian, he wasn't Anglican. He was Scottish, not.
Until he married Agnes, I'm sorry. Until he married Agnes. She put him on the straight and narrow.
He was still a savage. And I think these personality characteristics of what he grew up with, who he was, his father, etc. Then you have Egerton, farm boy, and he's bringing with him his Methodism. And we should perhaps take this a little more seriously in all of our discussions, the role of religion and how that came out to play. And Presbyterianism, used by Macdonald, would have come from that ethos of a bit downtrodden, a bit considered second rate, etc., by the dominant culture of Anglicanism and English people. So those things, I think, come into play in the development of a idea of who's above and who's below.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Do we have a response?
Go ahead, David.
Yeah, actually, Richard Gwynne points to that in his biography of Macdonald and argues that his Scottishness was quite significant in particular in his views towards Indigenous peoples. I don't buy it myself because there are plenty of examples of Scots who are extremely hostile to Indigenous peoples. To use the word that Patrice used in a different context, it's so speculative. I don't see any evidence for it, and I really, in the absence of evidence, good evidence to the contrary, I just don't see it. I've found so many examples of if you like, the abused abuser syndrome among the Irish and the Scots. When the Irish took over the slave colony of Montserrat, they were just as brutal as any other overseers. They did unto others what was done to them, only more so. There are examples of Scots who were extremely, as I say, extremely hostile to Indigenous peoples. So I'm skeptical about that, I must say. I'm not skeptical, however, about the importance of religion in general, because I think it's crucial. And I think in our secular age, we easily forget just how important religion was, how exercised people were by religious divisions, not just Catholic and Protestant, although they were serious enough, but denominational divisions were huge. And one of the things that I find really, really striking in a somewhat different context, but related to that, is how universities moved from being essentially religious institutions in the early 20th century to becoming secular institutions, and the battles that took place over that, the betrayals that the secularizers were accused of doing. I think this is really, really important subject. So I'm glad you highlighted it.
My great grandmother was a Scot.
And we come from good Scots Irish sheep stealing stock, Rick, I'll tell you.
I actually have a quote from John A. From the mid 1880s, maybe early 1880s, when he reflects on clans. And he says something to the effect that I come from clan. And we have to overcome clan for this country to work. We have to overcome it. He's speaking in terms of, especially he was speaking in terms of the Métis. But he was drawing the comparison, saying, we're all struggling. We're all struggling with clan, with our community. And the broader objective of Canadians should be to come together, to set aside that first allegiance to clan and see if it's at all possible to replace it with a broader sense of belonging. That's Macdonald's wish. And he did it in particular, and I think vehemently and eloquently, in terms of voting. In 1885, he's demanding for women to vote. He's eloquent. I want women to vote. He wants Indigenous people to vote.
Important point.
He doesn't want Chinese people to vote.
Right. But in 1885, Indigenous people
Yes,
would get the vote.
he would. They would.
Concerned.
But look at the fight he's facing in Parliament. The Liberals don't want women to vote. Wilfrid Laurier, number one. This will be the end of Canada if women have the right to vote. Indigenous people, are you serious? You're going to give Big Bear the right to vote? He just raised, his weapons against Canada. John A. Macdonald says, yes. He needs to get the vote. He needs to have the right to vote. Now, Macdonald is very clever. There are conditions around this. Nothing's straightforward, but he was the only one making that claim. He's only making the argument that Indigenous people should have the right to vote. And he was, the Parliament voted in favor, but under certain conditions. And you can read more about that when my book comes out.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you for your questions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.